Chapter 9 of The Mystery of a Turkish Bath. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Darvinia. The Mystery of a Turkish Bath by Rita. Chapter 9. Discussion. Colonel Estcourt came to the rescue. "No doubt," he said, "the subject, and this view of the subject, seems a little strange to our friends here. We must remember that they have not been accustomed to hear it freely discussed, as we have." "It is strange," said Mrs Jefferson, rallying her energies, "but we should not shirk its consideration for that reason. I quite agree with Madame Zairoff that people don't think half seriously enough of their real natures, the mysterious inner something which we all feel we possess, but whose voice we stifle in the din of the world. And yet," she added, sighing pathetically as she looked at the great Worth's creation, "the vanities are very pleasant. Why should we turn anchorites?" "There is not the slightest necessity to do that," said the Princess, smiling at the unuttered thought she had read in that glance. "Far from it. The gravest duties of life are generally those that meet us in the world, and are called forth by our actions in that world. All lives are not meant to be isolated, and certainly none for the whole period of earth life. A person would have to be very sure that he was free to cut himself adrift from his fellows, before he would even be permitted to do it." "Permitted?" echoed Mrs Jefferson rather vaguely. "But by whom?" "The teachers of occult science," answered the Princess Zairoff. "But who are they?" exclaimed the little American. "That I cannot tell you," she answered gravely. "They exist, and their influence is already beginning to make itself felt. But it would be a poor triumph to unveil the highest wisdom that humanity can ever learn, in order to satisfy the idle and the curious and the lovers of marvels. Those who desire to learn can always do so, but nothing is forced upon you, or even obtruded. I should not have opened my lips on the subject, had you not expressed a desire to hear something about it." "I suppose," said Mrs Jefferson eagerly, "you yourself are a believer in occultism?" "Madame Zairoff is a great deal more than that," said Colonel Estcourt. "She is one of its most earnest students and most ardent votaries. If you knew half of her marvellous powers, you would congratulate yourselves upon being permitted to receive her, unless, indeed," he added with a questioning glance at the beautiful woman beside him, "she has a fancy to make converts." The men became eager of entreaties to her so made, but the women held back a little. Princess Zairoff, however, assured them that she had no intention of proselytizing. "It is quite true I am deeply interested in this subject," she said, "but I should be sorry to bore you all with my views, or the reasons for my holding those views. Psychic inquiry demands a great deal more than cursory study. There are many mysteries of nature that men have looked upon as enigmas, until patience and research have solved them for them. Then they marvel how they could have been blind so long. Magnetism, spiritualism, and clairvoyance have all their mystical, as well as their explicable side. It is only because they don't readily lend themselves to the comprehension of our material nature, that we try to scoff them into the limbo of absurdity and imposture." "Ah!" said Mrs Jefferson, "talking of clairvoyance, that I do believe in. I knew a coloured woman in America. The way that woman would tell you things! It was enough to make your flesh creep. She'd just go quietly off to sleep, and you might ask her anything you liked, and she'd tell you, and it was all as true as possible." The princess met Julian Estcourt's eyes, and smiled strangely. Mrs Jefferson caught the glance. "Perhaps," she said, "you're a clairvoyant?" "I used to be," she said, gravely. "Perhaps my faculties have grown blunted for want of use. They are far from being as keen as they were in India. However," and she smiled at the circle of faces, "I wonder if any of you would believe me if I told you what you were talking about at dinner time. First of all, you must remember your conversation could not have been betrayed to me by my friend, as he was not there, and that my rooms are on the opposite wing to the dining saloon. Well, you discussed different phases of spiritualism. This lady," she indicated Mrs Masterman, "gave her experiences of imposture. You," looking at Mrs Jefferson, "combated those experiences by your own, and this gentleman," she smiled at the cynical individual who was hovering on the outskirts of the circle, "silenced you all by reducing your theories to strong common-sense facts. Shall I quote his own words? 'After the rate people have been running after spiritual phenomena, they are absolutely refreshing.' He said that it was an intensely humiliating idea to find oneself at the beck and call of any other human being when you imagined you had done with this life." "Good gracious!" almost screamed Mrs Jefferson. "But how on earth did you hear all this? It's positively alarming." "Well," said the princess, still smiling at the pale and conscience-stricken faces, "you see I have a faculty, shall I call it, that enables me to hear and see anything I am curious about or interested in. I don't believe I could even explain how I do it, but it seems easy and natural enough to myself. I only paid you a brief visit tonight, more that I might have a little bit of proof to give you that the powers I spoke of do exist, and are capable of being trained to almost any extent, if the motives for developing them are good. Have I convinced you?" She rose as she spoke, and stood facing them in her beautiful indolent grace. She was garbed in some white soft stuff, which floated round her like a cloud. The wide hanging sleeves were lined with faint shell-like pink, and fell away from her bare lovely arms to the hem of her floating draperies. She looked like some goddess of mythology, rather than a living woman, and as Julian Estcourt gazed at her, he felt a sudden thrill of awe. Could that more than mortal beauty ever really be his? His in the common prose of possession that can never be disassociated with marriage, the prose that is to the delicate subtle beauty of love what the rough touch is to the wings of the butterfly, the bloom of the grape? For a moment the thought seemed like sacrilege. He could have fallen at her feet in a sudden adoration of the divine beauty and purity of embodied womanhood. "If ever she has loved before," he said in his heart, "it must have been as a Vestal Virgin or a martyred saint. Where in the world is such another woman?" The voice of the cynical philosopher broke on his ear and disturbed his thoughts. "Madam, it is my humble opinion that you could convince us of anything you desired. Happy are those who have so charming a disciple to expound their doctrines. Happier still the fortunate few to whom those doctrines are to be expounded by lips so lovely and a heart so wise." Ere the circle had quite recovered from its astonishment at hearing a speech so flattering uttered by their surly Diogenes, they had parted to make way for the beautiful stranger, and the last gleam of her snowy robes had floated through the doorway, as a cloud melts into the darkness of descending night. There was a sort of long drawn breath, a feeling as of long tension suddenly set free, a turning as if by one accord to one another. Then then all the tongues leapt into action, and for the remainder of that evening, like Thackeray's folk at the Springs, they talked and they talked and they talked. Chapter 9.